All right, we should be live. Hello, all the humans. Welcome to the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix Sunday Speaker event. Please hit the like button and subscribe to get more of our awesome content, or better yet, become a member of HSGP and volunteer for something that fills you with joy. Today, we have Andrew Norman with Mental Immune Collapse, Mind-Parasites, and the Roots of Mass Irrationality. Andy Norman is an award-winning author and public philosopher. He studies how the mind's immune system works and helps people develop immunity to bad ideas. He thinks this is key to growing wiser together. Andy is currently testing a mind vaccine, a way to inoculate minds against viral nonsense. Andy directs the Humanism Initiative at CMU. He's done research on the evolutionary origins of human reasoning and the norms that make dialogue fruitful. He's published in Scientific American, Skeptic, Free Inquiry, and The Humanist. He's the author of Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. Please give a big HSGP welcome to Andy Norman.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. Can everybody hear me all right?
Sure can.
Coming through? All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. And it's really neat to connect with such a vital community. I was just learning before the session began what an amazing community you have. And it's really nice to make your acquaintance. Let me start with perhaps just a simpler self-introduction. About 40 years ago, I got really interested in the question of how minds screen and filter bad ideas. And it took me to philosophy graduate school, university professorship, a trip out into the world of software development, eventually back into teaching, and all of this, about 35 years of really hard reflection have culminated in a book I'm really tremendously proud of. Ron mentioned it. It's this, it looks like this, Mental Immunity. And that's going to be the basis of what I talk to you about today. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. So a couple questions to warm us up here. How many of you have, say, in the last couple of months, felt at least once that the world seems to be going crazy? Okay, looks like a pretty common phenomenon. How many of you have just felt utterly astonished at human credulity? Yeah. How many of you have felt despair in the face of what seems to be sort of rising irrationality? Yeah. So I think we're very much kindred spirits on these things. I'd like to argue that the prevailing narrative about the root causes of this phenomenon is not correct and not serving us well, and that it's high time we replaced it with an entirely new way of looking at the problem. So I'm going to describe the standard view this way. Some people learn how to think critically, others don't. And that those of us who acquire the right critical thinking skills consciously apply those skills to keep our minds relatively free of bad ideas, whereas others who lack the benefits of a similar education lack critical thinking skills and are therefore vulnerable to bad ideas in ways that disorient them morally and politically. Does that story sound familiar to anyone? It's probably similar to certainly the one I was raised on and the one that convinced me to become someone who has devoted the bulk of my adult life to actually teaching critical thinking. But I've come to the conclusion that the concept of critical thinking is far too blunt an instrument. And this idea that critical thinkings alone are enough to protect our minds from dangerously infectious ideas, that is hopelessly naive. In fact, this standard narrative, I think, is wrong in almost every particular. And it's certainly not up to the challenge of protecting internet-connected minds from what we might call viral nonsense that we see spreading in alarming ways these days. So Here's the better story, the story I think we need to replace that traditional narrative with. First of all, bad ideas are not just inert content. Some of them are in fact infectious entities that can infect minds and induce those minds to spread them to other minds. In other words, it's high time we took the idea of mind parasites seriously. And now when I speak of mind parasites, most people go, ooh, that sounds creepy. And I guess the language is designed to have that effect in part, but it's not as out there as you might think. There are now scholars who argue in highly prestigious journals that the only way to make good sense of the rapid spread of witchcraft beliefs in early modern Europe is to understand those beliefs as a kind of mind parasite that infected swaths of the European population. Furthermore, just think about the properties that bad ideas have. Number one is they require a host. Ideas can't just float out in a vacuum. They require a host of some kind. Ideas can sink roots into a host and turn that host into somebody will zealously spread that idea. In the same way that the flu virus can induce its host to sneeze copies of it onto other people. And bad ideas are harmful to their hosts almost by definition. So in the same way that COVID can harm the person infected with coronavirus, I think that there are certain infectious ideas that detract from the well-being of their hosts or enhance the well-being of their hosts at the expense of others. And both sets of mind parasites, I think, are enormously problematic. The second and related idea that I want to present, and I liked, although that first idea is by no means originated with me, the second one, I think I'm proud to have played a hand in helping to develop this idea. I think it's literally true that minds have immune systems. And by that, I mean that our minds have infrastructure for preventing mind infections or infectious ideas or harmful ideas from taking up residence in our minds. In fact, it's increasingly obvious to people who study evolutionary psychology that the mind probably had to evolve an immune system because the wrong ideas could get you killed, could get our ancestors killed. Now, when I say the mind has an immune system, I'm using language that not many people use yet. But it turns out that the science of mental immunity goes back almost 60 years. In the early 1960s, a psychologist named William McGuire discovered that if you expose a mind to a weakened form of an argument and then shoot down that argument, you can effectively inoculate that mind against stronger versions of the same argument. So when Donald Trump goes on national television and he ridicules a standard argument from the progressive left and treats it with derision, he's actually hijacking his own followers' mental immune systems and making them turn with unusual aggressiveness upon the progressive arguments and ideas that I imagine many of us share. So, third idea that is central to this is that just as the body's immune system marshals antibodies to fight off invaders, the mind's immune system will marshal doubts and reservations and qualms to try to fight off threatening ideas. And it's important to note that sometimes those mental antibodies, let's just go with doubts for simplicity's sake, sometimes they're marshaled not against false information, but against information that someone perceives to be threatening, and in particular, threatening to a chosen moral or political or religious identity. So the mind's immune system can be harnessed to fight off ideas that, for example, a demagogue doesn't want his followers to believe. Now, when I suggest that the mind, that doubts are the antibodies of the mind, I'm not just saying that those of us who generate more doubts are thereby have higher levels of mental immune health. The trick, it turns out, is not to generate massive numbers of doubts, but to generate the right kinds of doubts about the right things. If you've spent any time at all studying the phenomenon of flat Earth theory or anti-vaxxers, it turns out these people are not just without doubts. They're not just entirely uncritical. In fact, many of them are hypercritical. They're more critical than you and I are about certain reliable sources of information. There's a joke about that helps to illustrate this phenomenon. Fred the flat earther dies and goes to heaven. He's ushered into God's inner sanctum and he says, God, I have to know, I've spent my entire life promoting flat earth theory, so I have to know, is the world flat or is it round? And God shakes his head and said, I'm sorry to say, Fred, but the world is very round. And Fred's face registers shock and then recognition. And he says, this conspiracy goes higher than I thought. Okay. The point there is that a conspiracy theory infected mind will generate hyperbolic doubts to dismiss anything that threatens the conspiracy theory itself. And this is not an isolated phenomenon. People of all different ideological persuasions will generate sometimes over-exaggerated doubts in order to protect an ideology or an identity. So once we've come to the realization that minds have immune systems and that they function either more or less well to protect us from bad ideas. And incidentally, the role of a mental immune system is not just to screen out bad ideas, but it's also got to let in good ideas. So here's the real trick, right? Mental immune health is a balancing act. You need to be critical enough to keep out lots of the bad ideas, but not so critical that you're also filtering out a lot of good ones. And it's that balancing act that actually constitutes mental immune health in the same way that bodily immune health involves kind of a balancing act between being between the body's immune system being underactive or overactive. So scientists, immunologists call an overactive, the kind of illnesses caused by an overactive immune system are called autoimmune disorders. And it turns out that there are several mental autoimmune disorders, states of mind that are so aggressively critical, they attack the mind itself and the things that keep a mind moored to reality. So we can study mental immune systems the same way we study any other natural system. We can ask, how do these things work? What causes them to fail? And how do we make them work better? And I think this science, and I call it cognitive immunology, it's the science of mental immunity. I think that this science holds the key to restoring sanity in the digital age. In the same way that human populations were deeply vulnerable to smallpox before the smallpox vaccine was invented, in just the same way, the internet-connected mind of today is hugely susceptible to cognitive contagion in ways that we have not yet learned how to cope with. And the way we're going to develop the relevant expertise is to invest in the science of cognitive immunology, learn how mental immune systems work, and learn how to make them work better. And in the book, I argue that this cognitive immunology paradigm could in principle take critical thinking to much, much higher levels than what we have today. Trust me, I've taught critical thinking at the university level for over 20 years. Some of the best textbooks in the world about critical thinking basically just say, here are like 75 different fallacies that you can commit. Try to watch out for all 75 of them. Try not to commit them. And they also just urge you to be more suspicious of the arguments of others. Those are both hugely problematic prescriptions because, number one, a genuinely healthy mind isn't indiscriminately critical. It's carefully targets its critical questions on things that are objectively questionable. I realized after teaching critical thinking for a while from one of these standard critical thinking textbooks that my students were beginning to despair because they began to see critical thinking as a minefield. Oh my God, you mean there's 75 different ways that I can commit a fallacy and reveal how stupid I am? Forget about that. I have no interest in thinking. I could actually see some of my students beginning to respond this way to a traditional approach to teaching critical thinking. Moreover, it's very common for university professors to tell their students, give their students the following advice. Give me an argument paper and make sure you support your claims. Well, it turns out that that's a hugely confusing bit of advice for undergraduate students because it's not all claims that you have to support. In fact, the premises that you marshal in support of your essay's main conclusions are themselves claims. And if you had to provide arguments for them also, you end up with a regress problem, arguments for the premises of arguments for the premises of the arguments, right? You can't argue for everything. Certain things have to be taken as, need to be treated as functionally, as unargued premises. And trust me, university students can see or at least feel how inconsistently many university professors apply the advice, argue for your claims. They recognize that, yeah, the best critical thinking is argue for some claims, but they leave other claims unargued. Well, for what are the reasons some claims are properly treated as unargued premises? The traditional approaches to critical thinking don't answer that question, leave students confused and undermotivated to actually, and under-equipped to think critically. So in the book, I show that the traditional critical thinking program is problematic for all kinds of reasons, and that the prevailing ethos in our culture today compromises mental immune systems for several reasons. For one thing, we live in a culture that encourages parents to join a church and raise their children within a faith tradition. This essentially assigns a religious identity to the majority of the world's children before they have any ability to actually assess whether those religious articles of faith are worth believing. And then when those young people raised in the faith tradition come into contact with people like you and I who want to raise questions about their core convictions, they immediately get defensive because our questions threaten their identity. A Yale psychologist named Dan Kahan has done some amazing research on what he calls identity protective cognition. And it turns out that this is one of the most powerful distorting effects on thinking of all. You hitch your identity to certain beliefs, then your mind's immune system overreacts to questions or criticisms of those beliefs, and you become incapable of having a constructive rational dialogue with somebody about them. In the book, I also talk about several of what I call immune disruptive ideas. These are ideas that, if they take roots in your mind, actually discourage you from thinking well. One of these ideas is the idea that everyone is entitled to their opinion. People wield this idea to excuse fundamentally irresponsible thinking and believing. The idea that everyone is entitled to their opinion actually has deep humanistic roots, right? The Enlightenment thinkers who inspired the founding fathers of America actually recognized that it was terribly important that citizens have the legal right to express their opinions and to prevent the governments from cracking down on them. They express the view as everyone's entitled to their opinion, but we get confused between legal rights and moral rights. And what's happened after 200 or some years of treating this idea as almost orthodoxy is we've achieved a culture where almost everyone feels entitled to whatever beliefs they have, no matter how poorly thought out or how poorly evidenced. It's not a recipe for constructive dialogue. It's not a recipe for critical thinking. And it's certainly not a recipe for a world where cognitive contagion is nipped in the bud. Turns out that culture wars also damage mental immune systems. When you attach yourself to, say, a political ideology and partisanship grows, you increasingly identify with one of those two competing groups, and you begin to treat questions to your group's worldview as threats. And this can often happen beneath the level of conscious awareness, and we're all guilty of it. We start to think less critically about our own views or the views of our tribe than we do about those on the opposing side. In the book, I argue that reasons function like levers. So think of a lever sitting on a fulcrum, right? The lever arm is let's suppose you put some evidence or a rational consideration of one kind on the high end of the lever, and it pushes down, and the other end of the lever should, in principle, displace ideas or beliefs that are that are inconsistent with that evidence. Well, reasons can do this work of modifying our thinking and helping us learn, only if the fulcrum stands fixed. And the fulcrum that allows reasons to do what they do is fundamentally the idea that each and every one of us has an obligation to yield to better reasons. If I want you to yield to my better reasons, I have to be willing to yield to your better reasons. Without that shared ground rule, dialogue is pointless. Inquiry is subverted right out of the blocks. Science would go nowhere. Problem solving itself would be compromised. This idea that each and every one of us is honor bound and morally obliged to yield to better reasons, that's the fundamental condition on all of the practices that have given us a civilized world. And when somebody like Donald Trump comes along and simply defies that norm and says, I don't care about your evidence, I'm going to assert that my inauguration was the biggest one in history. When somebody does that and defies this elemental norm, I argue that it damages not just individual mental immune systems, but also our shared cultural immune system. Because just as minds have systems for stopping the spread of bad ideas, cultures also have systems for spreading the bad ideas. And this norm I call reason's fulcrum, is at the very heart of these systems. So probably the most important thing we can do to restore sanity to our world is to raise the next generation to understand that one of their deepest obligations they have is to update their beliefs in the face of better reasons. Not sometimes, not when it suits, when it happens to help you believe what you want to believe, but whether or not it forces a welcome belief change. I would argue that faith, the practice of raising children to believe that it's a virtue to accept things without evidence, does a lot to damage this critical norm that helps to keep us civilized. Now, we also want to know, what can we do about this? What's the solution? Well, the answer is that we need to begin strengthening mental immune systems, starting with ourselves. And then perhaps next with the next generation, and eventually trying to help strengthen the cognitive immune systems of, I don't know, QAnon followers and anti-vaxxers. So what works to strengthen mental immune systems? Well, number one, an identity that doesn't require you to defy reason, an identity like humanist is a really good place to start. The identity humanist is, there's enough of a commitment to rational belief change at the heart of humanism so that fundamental identity is a relatively good way. I mean, don't get me wrong, humanists can suffer from identity protective cognition just as everyone else can. But given the centrality of our commitment to honest inquiry, that's significantly mitigated. Identities like skeptic and rationalist and freethinker, I think, are also nice alternatives to more traditional religious and political identities. And I encourage every parent out there to give your children the gift of an identity that is perfectly compatible with honest inquiry. Just as there are ideas that weaken mental immune systems, and when our minds fill up with those, we become more susceptible to bad ideas. In just the same way, there are other ideas that strengthen mental immune systems. And when we install those ideas in people's minds, they tend to become better critical thinkers, more resistant to mind infections. Perhaps I should give an example here. Think of the idea that values are subjective. That idea has a great deal of currency, but it leads people to conclude that many values are fundamentally arbitrary. That you're entitled to your basic value premises, just as I'm entitled to my basic value premises. That idea gives people the idea that they're not fundamentally accountable for their core normative or evaluative convictions. It's an idea that actually weakens mental immune systems and subverts the kind of value inquiry that we need to become to develop rich and morally nuanced worldviews. The alternative is to understand that many values are, in fact, have a certain kind of objective validity. So most people want an example. Well, here's a very simple one. Kindness is objectively more conducive to shared well-being than cruelty is. In other words, there are good objective reasons for preferring kindness over cruelty. And the same goes for justice over injustice, honesty over dishonesty, and almost all the other core values that you can think of. You can show that they are objectively better at promoting our shared well-being. So I think that the idea that values can have an objective basis, and it doesn't need to be a religious foundation, can do a great deal, I think, to inoculate minds against ideas that prevent moral inquiry. I'm going to wrap up here because I'm really eager to get your questions, but here are a couple of practical takeaways for those who want to strengthen your own immune system, mind's immune system, and those in your orbit. Principle number one, listen to your doubts. Your doubts are the mind's antibodies trying to draw your attention to a problematic feature of an idea. If you tune out those doubts, you will become mentally immune compromised. If you develop the mental habit of paying close attention to the logical and causal properties of ideas that might somehow become problematic, and then voicing the doubts that result, your mind will begin to, your mind's resistance to bad ideas will grow stronger. And just as it's important to listen to your own doubts, it's important to listen to the challenges and objections of others without getting defensive. Treat challenges as opportunities to learn rather than as threats. And you can maintain the kind of equanimity or the right frame of mind for constructive dialogue and learning. Always remember that reasons are not weapons. Reasons should never be used as weapons. Reasons are fundamentally pointers for drawing other people's attention to relevant considerations. And they should be offered in a collaborative spirit so as not to trigger autoimmune reactions from those that disagree with you. Finally, I go on in the book to argue that the famous Socratic method, the process of asking clarifying questions to get really clear about what somebody is saying, that method is one of the most powerful mind inoculants ever invented, and that it's high time we brought it back into today's world and enhanced it into something even more powerful than it was in Socrates' hands. Just as the developer of a vaccine will take a naturally occurring inoculant and modify it into a vaccine, we can take the Socratic method and modify it into something we might call a mind vaccine, something that has tremendous power to help strengthen the mental immune systems of future generations. And that's what I try to do in the final chapters of the book. So if you're interested in helping to bring about this cognitive immunology revolution, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and give it a read and share what you learn with others. And there's another way to help, which is to get involved with a nonprofit that I'm launching called the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. It's basically, or CIRSE for short, it's basically an attempt to bring together the world's leading thinkers about cognitive contagion and to work out what smart public health measures we can take to prevent epidemics of unreason from tearing our world apart. If that sounds like a good mission to you, I hope you'll get in touch with me in the wake of this. Maybe there's a way you can help CIRSE change the world. Thanks very much for your attention. I'm eager to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was amazing. I really liked the epidemic of unreason comment at the very end. And I really enjoyed the framing, mental immune systems as an analogy to physical immune systems. I think that works really, really well. As always, raise your hand. We have a couple. I'm going to ask a question first. That's one of my privileges. So you mentioned that an example of an inoculation was a weakened position that could shoot down and defend against more aggressive ideas. Is that something like a straw man argument, or what would an example of that be?
Excellent. A straw man argument is a perfect example. So it turns out that rhetoricians, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of a straw man argument, if you paint a ridiculous version of somebody else's argument, it turns out to be easy to shoot down, right? Easy to tear apart, the same way a scarecrow is easy to tear apart. So a basic principle among philosophers is that always try to understand your opponent's argument in the best possible light. Do your best to interpret it as the strongest argument it can be. This is sometimes called the steel manning approach, right? Just Socrates was a master at this. He would help those he disagreed with make their arguments even sharper and better before he made any attempt to try to refute them. One of the virtues of that approach is that it shows sympathy and a willingness to understand where the person on the other side comes from. And an important thing to take away from this is that it's never fair to just to misrepresent somebody else's argument, especially in a way that makes it look weaker, and then just dismiss it. Not only is that just unfair argumentation, it also turns out to can have a powerful effect on a mind in a way that makes it resistant to certain forms of reasoning. So rhetoricians who use disdain and straw man argumentation to make their opponents look silly are actually hijacking people's mental immune systems to usually a political cause.
Thank you. So steel manning is great. Okay, so first we have Mark and Jim, then Alan, then Marty. Go ahead, Mark and Jim.
Thank you, Dr. Norman. Lots of excellent points you made today. Do you believe a person can be immersed in a religion and also be a critical thinker?
Yeah, I do, and I have many friends who are. I'm thinking first and foremost of a Unitarian church nearby, where honest inquiry is encouraged and dogmatic faith is not required. So I actually think it's high time the world's religions were reformed to become reason-friendly institutions. Now, I do say some things in the book that will cause consternation among the world's religious. But I go out of my way, steel manning here, to say, religious beliefs have a long history of helping people cope psychologically and socially. Religious beliefs seem to have very powerful ability to bring people together and give them a sense of solidarity. These are functions of belief that we should not ignore. It's actually wrong, it turns out, to say that all beliefs should be based on evidence, because some beliefs, we need to have some beliefs, not because of their what I call upstream evidence, but because of their downstream consequences on human well-being. So in fact, take the idea of human rights, which is central to humanism. There is zero empirical evidence that human rights exist. The only good reason to believe in human rights is because that belief has positive consequences. Things work out better for us if we treat each other as having rights. So I think we can honor the fact that religious beliefs have been functionally useful, even while questioning their literal truth. And we can help the world's religions evolve to the point where their beliefs are both useful and true. We can actually replace false but sometimes useful articles of faith with true and genuinely useful and long-term useful, not just short-term useful beliefs instead.
Thank you. Alan, you're up next.
And thank you for a really stimulating presentation.
Thank you, Alan.
I have some questions. There's a lot there and I haven't really clearly formulated it, but let me just kind of wing it a bit. I'd like to take a look at your presentation of the idea that ideas are parasitic. And question whether they are perhaps not parasitic, but symbiotic.
Love the question. I would certainly argue that good ideas are mind symbionts, the same way bad ideas are mind parasites. And there are many beneficial ideas out there, not just true, but also beneficial. And yes, those ought properly to be thought of as mind symbionts, I think. Biologists also have a concept of commensals. Apparently, some microbes are neither helpful nor harmful. They just go along for the ride without helping or hurting their hosts. There are ideas like that too. So I think mind commensals, mind parasites, and mind symbionts are all useful categories.
Well, as a follow-up to that, are they necessarily parasitic? Even though they may appear to be from one point of view, they are not necessarily from another. It seems to me that even those, let's say those who fall into the Trumpist camp, and who I think most of us would agree are deluged in a negative belief system, yet for them, it may not necessarily be true. It has certain strong advantages. For example, I read the flyer about your presentation today, and it piqued my interest, and I'm here. Simply because the concepts that you are presenting are syntonic with my own belief system. And therefore, what I would tend to do, and obviously do intend to do, is seek out those who are like-minded to my belief system, and listening to your presentation and the comments of others, that reinforces my belief system. Others may go into, maybe on the opposite side. If it's a Fox News presentation, their concepts are egosyntonic to them. So they don't see themselves as being infected, they see themselves as being reinforced.
Right. So a couple of things to say about this. First, I would say that the fact that a belief is advantageous, so let's say that belief in QAnon gives somebody a sense of purpose. I'm reading a book right now on QAnon belief, and the beliefs are utterly outrageous, but apparently people who get swept into down the QAnon rabbit hole develop a sense of passion and purpose that was missing from their lives. So it's clearly there's an advantageous element to QAnon belief. But not only are these the idea that Satan worshiping pedophiles rule our nation just plain false and ridiculous, it's also benefits its host at the expense of others, right? When QAnon followers go and sack the US Capitol, they're benefiting their irresponsible indulgence of selfishly advantageous believing harms our nation as a whole. So the relevant standard of benefit or advantage has to be all of us. It's not enough to indulge in beliefs that are personally advantageous if it's going to cost if other people have to bear the cost. It's to do that is fundamentally selfish. So I think a lot of religious believing has this quality. It gives somebody comfort, gives somebody a sense of peace of mind. But because it divides people into competing camps, mutually irreconcilable camps, it harms our long-term collective well-being. So we need to raise our game. We need to raise our standard. I'm not saying that we should run around pointing fingers at Trump supporters and saying, your mind is infected. That's a very bad way to approach somebody you want to persuade. But we can develop far more useful analytical tools by thinking of it in this way, I think. And it can help us understand how to dialogue more fruitfully in ways that might just open a crack so they can actually, so evidence can slip in.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, we have Marty, then John, then Chet, who can't raise his hand. So Marty, you're next.
Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Wonderful talk, a brand new way to think about things. But the concept of fulcrum or an unmoving fulcrum, I think there are times and places that the fulcrum needs to be moved, as in science, interpretation of the Constitution, that kind of thing. That's a question, actually.
It's a good question. So notice, I mean, Marty's picking up on something. I mean, she's showing real sharpness here. I'm actually advocate this idea of reason's fulcrum. To my way of thinking, it deserves a certain amount of reverence. It's not that I necessarily will argue that it should be treated as sacred or unquestioned. It's not that we should never question reason's fulcrum as an idea. But there's certainly a danger that if we treat it as sacrosanct, that it will become dysfunctional in certain ways, right? And that's a possibility I have to admit, and I'm happy to admit. I should also say, though, that reason's fulcrum is the kind of thing that I have subjected to critical testing for, again, over 20 years now. And it continues to withstand that scrutiny in ways that I'm quite impressed with. So when science comes, if science were to build, say, an evidence-based argument that reason's fulcrum only works within certain parameters. So I would have to acknowledge that ought properly to modify the relevant conviction. But go ahead, Marty. You were.
Well, no, I just realized that applying it to reason is slightly different than the things that I was talking about.
Say more about that.
The fulcrum concept applied to reason is slightly different than what I was talking about. That one you need to be very, very careful to move. When it applies to reason, the concept.
So the idea itself is that we're morally obliged to yield to better reasons. So that's the fulcrum itself. And I take it that you're asking about, what happens when you question reason itself?
Possibly, but I'm thinking in particular right now, and what I see as one of the divides is the interpretation of the Constitution. Is it a frozen document? Is it a dead document? Or can we bring its concepts forward with what we've learned since 17, whatever it was, 80, whatever.
Beautiful. So nice point, Marty. So one of the most interesting provisions of the US Constitution is the idea that you can amend that very Constitution. There are processes in place that allow the Constitution to be modified, and those processes have been used many times to add amendments to the Constitution. So the Constitution is a living document. It's one that evolves, or at least in principle, can keep evolving to meet our needs. I think that's wise design.
But there are people who believe it is chiseled in stone. I'm just saying that's one of the divides I see.
I accept that. Thank you. I'm going to let that point stand because I think it merits consideration. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Marty. John, you are up next, and then we have Chet. John, go ahead.
Okay. I've heard before about physical reasons, parts of the brain causing people to be more resistant to changing their opinion. And I just found this paper online it's a prefrontal cortex and impulsive decision making. How would do you believe any of that could be partially true? And how would you deal with the person if you're trying to help them be more critical in their thinking?
Yeah, so I think neuroscience has a lot to teach us about how we think, and also those realizations come with interesting implications for how we should try to think. So the prefrontal cortex is a relatively new lobe of the brain, and it appears to be the seat of what psychologists call system 2 thinking, or what Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning psychologist, calls slow thinking. So we have, our minds can generate conclusions very rapidly to meet pressing needs. So, you detect a bus out of the corner of your eye and your instincts take over and you leap out of the way of the bus, right? That's fast thinking, and it works well for certain automated processes. But sometimes our sort of habitual or automatic way of responding to things don't really work so well. And when that happens, it helps to step back from our ingrained behaviors and engage the frontal cortex and ask ourselves, wow, is this really serving us well? Let's think this through more slowly and see if we maybe need to modify our behaviors in some way. That's slow thinking. And we need to think. It's hard to think slowly and in a fair-minded way when you feel assaulted by partisans on another side of a political divide. Understanding this can give us at least a certain degree of equanimity and an ability to kind of resist the emotional urge to strike back, say, at someone who offers an argument that you dislike. There's another really interesting piece of neuroscience. It turns out you've heard of the fight or flight response. Certain environmental stimuli are threatening, and they trigger something called the sympathetic nervous system, which basically diverts all of the blood in the brain or the blood in the body to the muscles and the fighting or fleeing, right? But it turns out we can't think for shit when our sympathetic nervous system is engaged. Fortunately, we also have a parasympathetic nervous system that calms our thinking down and helps us think in a more judicious, even-handed way. And that's what we need to get back to. So I would argue that the prefrontal cortex in combination with the parasympathetic nervous system are critical infrastructure for the mind's immune system. And we need to learn how to use them to best effect, which can be hard in the midst of a culture war.
Yeah, thank you. As a meditator, noticing when emotions are heightened and taking the steps necessary to calm yourself and put that prefrontal cortex back online is critical to making good decisions, right? Because you said it very clearly, when your parasympathetic nervous system your sympathetic nervous system is all heightened, your prefrontal cortex goes offline. So,
yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, Ron. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Chet, real quick before I get Chet on, do you have a link that you prefer we use when purchasing your book? And do you have a URL for the Cognitive Immunology Research Initiative that we could get?
Yeah. So I don't have any particular preference on where you buy the book. Maybe a local bookstore instead of Amazon, but I think a local bookstore might require that you make a phone call and ask them to ship it in, but it is available at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, bookshop.org. As for the nonprofit, Circe, I'll put the URL right in the chat.
Perfect.
And I hope you'll check it out, because not only does it explain the science and the history of the science, it also gives you ways you can apply its findings to promote constructive dialogue in your community, for example, and suggest other ways that you can help bring about some, I think, badly needed change. So here it is.
Perfect. All right. Next up, we have Chet and then Jennifer. Chet, you're up. Chet? You're muted. Asked to unmute you. There you go.
There we go.
I'm sorry. I wanted to say that I enjoyed your talk. And when you started out, I was a little put off because I thought it was going to be another talk about critical thinking. And I really loved the questions you put up, because I don't see myself as a critical thinker. I mean, I was born into certain cultures that are held together by certain ideologies and belief systems. And those things become my identity. Not only is my identity in those values, those ideas, but it's also on a piece of paper at a courthouse somewhere that says, tells me what my rights are as a human being, that tells me I have a right to live on earth. And so when someone threatens those courthouses, I'm ready to drop atomic bombs on them. Not because it's a critical perspective on anything, but I'm trying to protect my identity.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Chet, for that admission. I mean, I think we should all be similarly candid that we are prone to identity protective cognition also. It's not as though we humanists are immune to this phenomenon.
Yeah, and I want to also mention that your idea of a virus, that the brain for right now, for whatever reason, is allowing to get us into this state of affairs. I think that's a real important concept, because when we think about immunity systems, those are automatic. You don't have to think, they just work. And I know that biological brains can sustain the life of species, or we wouldn't exist. So I'm saying we have to come to a new comprehension of what our circumstances are, in such that our brain is able to do its thing. And basically, I concluded, whether right or wrong, that all ideologies, even the ones I live by, even ones that give me a right to live on this earth, are brain viruses.
I love it, Chet. That's music to my ears. Sometimes people use the word ideology in a way that's just kind of neutral. Any belief system is an ideology.
Yeah.
I think that's a missed opportunity. We should reserve the term ideology for systems of ideas or beliefs that are objectively not serving us well. And so I tend to agree with Chet that all ideologies are problematic, certainly to the extent that they are resistant to rational revision. The idea that our minds can actually become infected with mind viruses or mind parasites goes back to Richard Dawkins. You probably recognize his concept of a meme there, but he actually wrote an essay called Viruses of the Mind, also in the early 90s, that kind of got me onto this idea. And in that essay, he makes a passing reference to the idea, he compares a 4-year-old who will believe in the tooth fairy to an immune compromised adult, because their mind's immune systems can't fight off the mythology of the tooth fairy the same way an adult mind would. This was just a kind of a passing observation by Dawkins, but this struck me in the early 90s that it was important to develop this idea and into a full-blown science of mental immunity to bad ideas. And honestly, guys, I think this science of mental immunity could change the human condition as profoundly as the original immunology changed the human condition. Think about it. The germ theory of disease and immunology together have saved hundreds of millions of human lives. They've transformed our situation from one where we're plagued by all kinds of invisible agents that diminish our well-being and cause suffering into one where we're largely, well, this is a strange thing to say in the midst of a pandemic, but we are so fortunate to have the science of immunology to protect us against parasitic microbes. I think in the same way that we look back on the Dark Ages, an age of disease and high susceptibility, we're going to look back on our time and say, those unbelievably benighted people didn't have cognitive immunology to protect their minds from mind infections. And that's one reason they're divided by crazy ideologies and why their world is so dysfunctional. We can transform this world in, I think, a profound way by developing this science and applying its findings.
I am looking forward to that future, sir. Jennifer, then Brian, then Alan. Jennifer, go ahead. There you
Hi.
go.
I had a question. You bring up the idea that, the goal of, to bring people out of, this through, into a new ideas and ways to do that. Do you address how to live once that transformation has occurred? Like I would say, like I consider myself a recovering conservative, but the process of what I go through every day when I meet a family member, or also more on a personal note, how do you address the trauma? Because I go into more avoidance. I just, I don't want to listen to them.
So I apologize. I'm not sure the connection was as good, nice there as I'd like, Jennifer. So I cut the gist of the question. Was this having to the question of how you talk to family members who are, for example, gone down rabbit holes?
Or when you have your brother call your sister, like, how did you survive it? Jennifer's for a whole week, to another sibling, or, how do you, as somebody who faces that, like in everyday life,
Yeah. Okay.
Address that.
Yeah, I hear you. So a couple things. The book is has much more to say about preventing mind infections than curing them. So it turns out that an ounce of mind inoculation is worth like a pound of cult deprogramming. It's really hard to help somebody, to rescue somebody from a cult, but it's relatively easy to teach a child how to spot a mind virus. So I think I have more hopes for our ability to transform the situation for future generations. But that's not to say we should give up on the family members who have become kind of, raving Trump supporters or whatever. Those conversations are hard. And I do think that cognitive immunology has some really interesting implications for how to have those conversations. And I've been fortunate to have a role at Carnegie Mellon University, where I've basically been leading groups of students to have difficult conversations about ethics, politics, and religion almost every day for about 15 years. And when you do that repeatedly, you start to learn how to have these difficult conversations in ways that get people to really open up and hear you. The book contains as much of what little wisdom I've gained on that dimension is in the book. So by reading it, you'll probably learn some tips and some tricks, but I can't promise to make those conversations easy.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Next up, we have Brian and then Alan. Go ahead, Brian.
And well, your last two answers answered most of my questions. So, and I totally agree with you on all this and how essential it is. But can you give me an example of how you could teach a child to become inoculated?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So imagine being a, third grade teacher, and you have the story rug, right? Where you can sit down cross-legged with a book and call the kids over and everybody sits down and listens to a story. You can also have philosophical discussions with kids at that age. And kids are actually really very curious about deep philosophical questions. There's actually a movement called Philosophy for Children that gets kids thinking about what's real and what's not. How do you know? And how do you know right from wrong? And what makes right things right and wrong things wrong? Anyway, these are questions that kids will thrill to if you introduce them in the right way. There's a wonderful video online that I'll refer you to. Brian, you might have to do a little searching to find it, but on YouTube, there's a video of a dad who uses a technique called street epistemology to get his two kids, like ages 7 and 5, to think about what's real and what's not. And he asks some questions like, is Nemo from the cartoon fish? Is he real? And one of the kids says, yes. The other kid says, no. And he says, okay. And he's just a really good listener. He uses active listening to say, okay, so I hear you saying that he is real, and I hear you saying he's not. What are your reasons? And then one kid will share them, and the other kid will share them, and then they jump in. And before you know it, they're doing amazing philosophy. And you can see their mind's ability to test fundamental assumptions just developing right before your eyes. It's a beautiful demonstration. And I think maybe we ought to teach all kids, give all kids a chance to engage in philosophical questions from a young age.
I love that, and we'll be Googling the philosophy for children. I think that's amazing and a wonderful skill to have. I would love to have had that when I was young. Yes. Excellent, excellent. Alan, you are up, sir.
Okay, this is not what I initially intended to bring up, but your comment about working with children and inoculating them. One of the things that I did in my past life was work as a school psychologist. And a kid was brought to my attention who was belligerent, always getting into fights and angry. And as it turned out, he kind of had, I'm not saying he was paranoid, but he really was insecure and felt everybody was kind of out to get him. And so he was going to get them first. I devised this little thing that worked incredibly well and very much along the lines of what you're talking about, and I'll share it with you. I went into the store and I bought a couple of pairs of little kid glasses, sunglasses. One was red and one was blue. And I went into the second grade classes and I told them, we're going to do a thing. And I brought with me these magic sunglasses. And when you put on the red sunglasses, everybody you look at is going to be your enemy. And when you put on the blue sunglasses, everybody you look at is going to be your friend. And the kids got all excited, so they started trying out the sunglasses. And sure enough, that's exactly the way they acted out. And one kid, probably one of the future psychologists in that class, said, hey, that's the way Jimmy acts all the time. He must think that everybody's his enemy. And we went on from there. And I did that many times with many classes. It always worked.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you for that story. That's I can see that having a real power to help people think about, help kids think about the lenses through which they see the world. Beautiful.
That becomes me as a believer in phenomenology.
Yep.
Can I mention just in that connection, there's a wonderful new book out called Humankind, A Hopeful History by a Dutch historian. He basically argues that the idea that humans are fundamentally selfish is kind of like your equivalent of the red glasses. If you walk around with a picture of human nature where human beings are fundamentally depraved and selfish and mean-spirited, you will expect that of other people and typically get the very thing you expect. Meanwhile, if you actually have a more accurate picture of human nature as fundamentally cooperative and kind, it's like having the blue glasses. You'll look for that, you'll find it more often, your worldview will be reinforced, and it can become a positive spiral instead of a negative one. Highly recommend that book. It's beautifully written as well.
That's awesome. The perspective that we choose is what we see more of in the world. I absolutely agree with you, sir. Roy, I think this is going to be one of the last questions. You are up, sir.
Thank you. I have really enjoyed your presentation, and the information that I've written down, it helps me remember now when I do that. I just wanted to say that I really understand, I think, pretty well what you're saying, because I was not brought up in a religious atmosphere at all. And both my parents were very intelligent. My dad was a genius. And he was very skeptical of senseless theories and this kind of thing. He always wanted to have evidence and reason for doing or thinking certain things. And I think this is, I haven't done everything right, no question about that, but I think that having that environment at a very young age has made me more careful about jumping into things that I probably shouldn't. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think understanding that it's important to be wary of certain ideas is a really important thing to bestow on children. But again, indiscriminately suspicious is not the right attitude to, right? You don't want to teach a kid to just be suspicious of everything and to attack everything with critical argumentation. And I'm not suggesting that that's your approach by any means. But this is where the cognitive immunology paradigm, I think, lets us go far beyond the critical thinking paradigm and give kids a more powerful set of thinking tools. I think you're muted, Ron.
Yep, I was. Thank you very much. So before we wrap, is there anything else that you'd like to wrap with, sir?
Thanks for asking. So at the beginning, I asked you if you shared some of my fears about rising levels of viral nonsense and mass irrationality. And I think many of you indicated that you do share those fears. If you do share those fears and you buy my argument that the science of mental immunity is the solution to inoculating and strengthening our minds against infectious ideas and infectious ideologies, if that's true, I hope you'll reach out to me and help me grow cognitive immunology as a movement. There's a role, I think, for researchers to actually understand the mind's immune system better, but there's also a role for people of many different descriptions to pick up these ideas and begin applying them and help integrating them into institutions so that we can hand a sustainable world to our children and our grandchildren. So please, I'll put my email address in the chat and encourage you to reach out if you think you can contribute to CIRCE's efforts in any way. We're in the process of fundraising right now, and a donation would certainly be one way you could help out.
Excellent, excellent. I'm all in, sir. I think this is critical. It's important that we learn ourselves and teach our children so that we can have a better world. Yeah. So thank you very much for bringing this before our community and to the interwebs in general. With that, I wish to thank everyone for coming and giving this your attention. Remember, if you enjoyed our content, then please hit the subscribe button, contribute to our Patreon, become a member of HSGP, or better yet, volunteer to make the magic happen. Be well, stay safe, take care, and goodbye, HSGP.
Thank you all.
And